When I moved to Singapore about 2.5 years ago, the first place that I lived was in the Tanglin Halt neighborhood. My wife and I rented a small apartment on a shop house inside the sort of market area, the food center area. And we found the neighborhood really a nice place to live. Lots of amazing food, famous food there. And it's also close to what was the former railway track to Malaysia. And so there's which has now been removed about 4 or 5 years ago, leaving a kind of green space that we would often be able to walk into. And it's one of the older of the HDB developments in Singapore. And so there's a very old sort of neighborhood there. And in fact, a lot of people who were some of the original residents are still living there, including our landlord who ran the barber shop downstairs. So his father had originally moved there, who was also a barber. They lived above the shop in the apartment where my wife and I were moving into. Some things, he showed me some photos of the 1960s when his father had first moved to the area, when where it was developed at that time, around it was still countryside essentially. So he said there would be animals coming through, like domestic animals as well as wild animals. And he showed some photos of his father performing some musical performances in the public space there. In fact, we already knew there was some sort of ominous feeling about the place, because the original apartment in that neighborhood we'd attempted to rent was slated for demolition, and so they'd offered us a 4-month rent, and we thought that wasn't really enough for us. We needed maybe more security of time, so we chose this other place that had a longer period left. But after about 1 year of living there, we did find out there was the entire neighborhood, all of Commonwealth and Tanglin Halt neighborhood, had been selected for redevelopment. So by, I think, 2020, the whole area will be torn down. That sort of created a whole different way of interacting with the space for us. I think it's mostly only that it's one of the older HDBs. So the first construction was done by a predecessor to the HDB called the SIT. They had built a number of buildings in that area. But in other words, it's one of the oldest of the public housing in Singapore. The oldest of the what are called satellite estates, meaning that it's non-continuous with the downtown city core. And so when it was developed as an entire neighborhood with services and everything, even some of it preceding. So some of it was during the period when it was Malaysia, and then taken over by HDB as it became the independent Singapore. There's actually currently an exhibit at the NUS Museum, which you can actually see, that has some of the history and memories of the HDB developments and charting some of the redevelopment projects that have happened. And I do know that this one in particular was developed with an idea of creating a kampong type sociality within a public housing estate. So that is a very interesting idea, I think. From what I can observe, at least, I haven't been able to see yet the sort of initial planning documents. I would really like to do that and sort of look into more who were the people that planned it and what they were thinking about. But what I can see is they basically developed the residential buildings, which are 10 to 12-story apartment buildings, are situated around. In the center is a kind of market area. It actually has 2 markets. Each of the market areas are surrounded by shop house buildings that have a sort of more low-lying scale. And then there's actually some public space as well made available with trees and open space. So I think one of the ideas was knowing that the need was to develop larger scale buildings for people to live in, but also to create a public space that had a lower scale, that more kind of in accordance with the kinds of environments people were familiar with, as well as one could say some kind of a human scale, I guess. And then having a very clear public area in the center of where the residences. There are definitely conflicting feelings and views among people. I mean, certainly conflicting feelings in the sense that people feel some sadness about the community that is going to be lost. But a lot of people feel quite satisfied or happy with the kinds of compensation that are being given for the redevelopment. The government will provide will repurchase the flats as well as offer the ability to buy a flat in a new development that's being constructed right now. So one of the reasons why there's a delay, they've announced the demolition but aren't starting or aren't moving people out. They actually have to build these new buildings first that people can be moved into. And those are going to be down the street. People are very aware that the feeling, the environment, the atmosphere, the community aspects are not going to be the same. One of the main concerns is that the hawker centers that are there, which are very well known, some of the food stalls are famous across Singapore, and people who live there are very appreciative of those food stalls and the relationships to the hawkers. Those are possibly not going to be moved to the new location. The railway line was owned by Malaysia, not by Singapore. There was some, I think, concern about Malaysia owning a tract of land that actually went all the way into the center of Singapore. So what they did is, I think they bought it from Malaysia or made a land exchange. And they've moved the railway station to Woodlands, which is at the border with Malaysia. Well, it's a very interesting space because there were some usages, or at least some have appeared since the tracks have been taken away. For instance, there was a lot of informal religious usages, like some temple-type spaces. There was one in the Tanglin Halt neighborhood right at the edge of the railway track where there was a tree and some kind of altar-type things that a few old people would gather in that area. So then that was recently, the tree was cut down. So because it was an illegal use of state land. So the railway track is being redeveloped eventually as a recreational space. They had a competition for what to do with the railway track, but keeping it as a recreational space. And so they announced the winner of that competition, and they showed their plans, which are, I mean, in my view, there's negative. I mean, I think some imagined ideal, I would think you could just leave the space as it is, but I'm happy to see that they're planning to keep it as a continuous trail, not just cutting it up, and trying to keep some balance between recreational and environmental aspects. I have been back to Commonwealth, but I haven't walked on the trail again recently.